welcome to Nearly Shabbat on the Hill. For the benefit of Lord Mann, I'm just going to explain how we got to call this Nearly Shabbat on the Hill. Usually on the Shabbat service on a Saturday morning, we have a speaker once a month. And when the lockdown started, I suggested to Rabbi David that we should try and do something similar on a Sunday evening. And he thought it was a great idea and said, why don't we call it Nearly Shabbat on the Hill? It's only a day and a half late and we don't have a Kiddush. But so here we are with what must be about the 10th of this series that we've run. And this evening, we're really honored because we've got Lord John Mann, who used to be a Labour MP until not that long ago, in fact, the last election when he stood down, and he's now Lord Mann. He's also leading on anti-Semitism for the government, which is going to be quite interesting, an ex-Labour MP doing that. And we've also got our own Dave Rich from the Community Security Trust. And whilst I've got him here, I have to say, early on in this series, I asked Dave if he would do a talk for us one evening, and he quite fairly pleaded that the pressures of work and the amount of time he spent in front of a screen meant that he'd prefer to just be an ordinary community member. However, when the rabbi persuaded Lord Mann to come and speak to us, Dave Rich very kindly stepped up and agreed to interview Lord Mann. And so I'm now going to hand over to Lord Mann and to Dave Rich and leave them to do the talking, and I will shut up.
Thank you, Stephen. You're absolutely right. I could not resist the invitation to take part in this event tonight. Lord Mann, or John Mann as he was for many years in Parliament, has been an absolute champion for the Jewish community of fighting anti-Semitism for many, many years, going back all the way to when he was a student back at Manchester University, and then as chair of Labour students in the 1980s, when he helped to fight off the attempts to ban Jewish societies at some universities. And I've been honoured to know John for many years. And there could literally be no one better to come to talk to the community today. And John, I should let you know, today is an auspicious day for Muswell Hill Synagogue because we had our first service in person after the lockdown was held in the car park of the synagogue this morning. I believe there was a journalist present. I saw a little video from the rabbi. So it's a special day for us. And I'm really pleased that that you're here to speak to the community tonight. So I think what's going to happen is we're going to talk. I'm going to ask you some questions for about half an hour or so, and then we're going to throw it open to questions from everyone here. We'll make sure there's plenty of time for everyone to ask what they want to ask about. But the first question I want to ask really, and it's a pretty broad one, you are now the independent advisor on anti-Semitism to the government, having been appointed in that role by the previous Prime Minister. And I believe that requires you to report to the government once a year to tell them what's going on with anti-Semitism in this country and advise them of what to do. So what do you think you'll be saying to the government about anti-Semitism in 2020 in Britain?
Well, I'm not, Dave, just going to leave it to once a year. I've been given a little bit of advice already. And the advice I've given so far is very short, very succinct, which is that there is no reason for the government to do anything different at the current time in relation to anti-Semitism. But government has to be prepared for the possibility, perhaps the likelihood, of a significant growth in anti-Semitism in this country if there is a major economic downturn, which most economists think will happen worldwide and in the UK. And as ever, people look for someone to blame. And that will become a very dangerous point. And so what I've warned government is they don't need to do anything new at the moment, but they need to be alert to the likelihood that there could be a growth in anti-Semitism and who knows how bad the economy will be, and the difficulties and dangers that will occur, not least for the Jewish community, from that.
Now, as I said, you started fighting anti-Semitism in your political career when you were a student in the 1980s. You took over chairmanship of the all-party parliamentary group against anti-Semitism in 2004, thereabouts, the early 2000s, I think it was.
2005.
2005, when you held that a really groundbreaking parliamentary inquiry into the issue. And you're still very much at the coalface now. So I suppose with that kind of decades-long experience, I'm just interested to know what you think has changed over that period in terms of anti-Semitism in this country, and what you think is really kind of the same as when you first got involved in this struggle.
I think the problems are no different. I mean, anti-Semitism mutates in different ways. But in that inquiry, we identified three problems. Traditional right-wing anti-Semitism, despite all the education, it hadn't gone away. What was described as new, though it wasn't new, left-wing anti-Semitism. And this is 2005-06, when we were warning in a very big way, and I was speaking out a lot on this, and most people ignored us. We were right. And you were there, of course, in the middle of that. But we were right in highlighting that as a big problem, and it's proved to be. And thirdly, Muslim anti-Semitism, which we identified at the time had never been a problem in this country, because it couldn't have been. There hadn't been really a Muslim population going back many decades. Now there's a big one. So by definition, there's a bigger problem. And none of those three have changed. The only big change, and it is significant, since 15 years ago, is the growth of the internet. And what the internet's done, I think if I could just give you an example that I've used a lot to illustrate it. In the past, you'd have Billy No-Mates who'd sit at home on his computer or in his bedroom, spewing out his hatred, and nobody would talk to him, and he'd be able to talk to nobody else. The internet's allowed Billy No-Mates to connect up with Hans No-Mates or Pierre No-Mates, and that gives them an empowerment, because tiny numbers feel they're a bigger organization than they are. And that empowerment has been very, very dangerous. It's given those people a voice I don't think they really had before. And of course, it's also allowed organized groups, be it terror groups or organized political groups, much more effect. And I think we've been slow to respond. I think we've been far too slow, far too passive in responding. I think we're a lot better now. So that's the big difference. On the positive side, in this country, the Jewish community, I think, is better organized than it can ever have been. And it's better organized than, I think, any other Jewish community in the world. And I pick my words carefully there, in the world and any. I think this is the best organized community in the world. Not everything's perfect, it never will be. But we have things others don't have. And I think it's vital that we celebrate the successes, continue them, learn from them, share them with other communities, not least your own organisation, Dave, the CST, which has been doing that, but as well be honest about the problems and where we've not been good enough. And certainly on the internet, overall, we've been too passive and we've ceded too much ground, and we're going to need to work hard to pull that back and get ahead of the game.
So on that issue of the internet and social media and the role it plays in it, I know there's a campaign at the moment which has been pioneered by the Anti-Defamation League in the United States and other organizations to persuade advertisers to not spend any advertising money on Facebook for the month of July. And I know some have gone even further, and that's got a lot of support. And I know you've supported it publicly as well. Do you think that kind of pressure on social media companies is the way forward? What can we do as individuals who are on those platforms? I mean, should we all be deleting our Facebook accounts? What can be done?
I think two things are needed. There needs to be better legislation, and there's an internet harms bill that will appear in Parliament and be passed by Parliament this year. I think probably towards the end of the year that will be legislated for, and that could make a significant difference if that's got right. And it's vital the Jewish community is thoroughly engaged and ruthlessly organised in that, setting clear priorities. And I shall be screaming at community organisations, initially privately, if I feel they're not, because we can't miss that opportunity. But I've said for a long time that we can't just rely on the legislation. And therefore, the advertising campaign and commercial pressure is huge. And what we're bad at, I think, in this country, is we're bad at using the contacts, the expertise, the brilliance that's out there. People are often a little reticent, perhaps feeling unempowered. And the more people pressure, for example, corporates, for them to pressure. If I run a company, or I'm a shareholder in a company, or I'm a customer of a company, I don't want that brand of that product on the internet next to some anti-Semitic bile from some extremist. That's bad for the brand. It's not what I want to see. And so that pressure can go well beyond this 1 month campaign, which I think is a brilliant campaign and clearly been very successful. But the other thing that people watching, listening in can do is they can take up the IRA declaration, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which we want everyone to adopt. And by everyone, because governments adopt it, political parties have adopted it, we want them to use it, not just adopt it. But every football club, every sports organisation, every university, every employer should be adopting that and using it. And that's very powerful. You imagine if the football clubs in London all adopted it and used it with their reach into their supporter base in this country and across the world. That'll have a huge impact. I think that's doable. If every university was to do it, and there'll be people who are listening in now, watching now, who will have contacts in a football club, in a university. Some will be well positioned. We need those people to be taking this and asking their organisation where they have influence to adopt this definition, because that is very, very big league, and that will get us on the front foot. You can't deal with a problem if you don't define it clearly. Defining it clearly empowers the Jewish community and empowers everyone who wants to fight against racism and anti-Semitism. And so that's a big ask, but it's a practical one for every single person tonight.
I mean, we remember the struggles to persuade the Labour Party to adopt the IRA definition, and it proved to be crucial. And I know the Jewish Leadership Council in particular have done a fantastic job of working with local authorities around the country to adopt it. And then, as you say, the important thing is not just to adopt it, but to use it. So I really echo that call for people to take that definition and try and get it applied in different places. I want to just come back to what you said about how when you did the inquiry into anti-Semitism in 2005, you picked up on the different strands of anti-Semitism that were growing in this country. And one of the things you picked up on was left-wing anti-Semitism. And this was at a time when not many people, certainly in Parliament, were talking about it or thinking about it. And as you say, it proved to be phenomenally prescient, depressingly so, in fact. And of course, you were a Labour MP for 18 years, from 2001 until last year. So I suppose I do want to ask you a bit about what happened in the Labour Party over the last few years. And I suppose I want to ask you is, was there a moment, either before Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader or after, when you realised this is getting out of control, this is now mainstream and this is now taking over?
If I could uncharacteristically not quite answer that question, but answer one that lies behind it, because I recall a discussion with a very leading member of the Jewish community, who everyone will know, when I first chaired the all-party group, so that would be 2005, who said, "John, I don't see any anti-Semitism in this country." And my response was immediately, "Well, you don't operate in the same circles that I do, because it's always been prevalent, it's always been there, it's always been recognizable. And I first came across it haphazardly, individually, when I was a teenager. And when I became a student, I saw how invidious it was, and how, particularly on the left, people didn't understand anti-Semitism, that it didn't have the same automatic response that other racisms did have. And that was a big learning moment. And I didn't fully understand why. I think now, reading and thinking about it, one can see reasons why. But the critical thing was, it was there. And so what happened with Corbyn, etc., was no particular surprise. Corbyn becoming the leader was a nasty shock, and that gave a voice. A lot of those people who were outside the Labour Party and pretty irrelevant came in, so you suddenly had a mass of them, and that fed others. And we had cheerleaders for anti-Semitism and others joining in. I think that's getting knocked back pretty effectively now, but those key cheerleaders, even if they've left the Labour Party, are still in society. They haven't gone away, and they're probably better organised than they were 5 years ago, because they organised themselves within the Labour Party. So there is a legacy from Corbyn and Corbynism that remains dangerous. And if we let up on it, we're making a very big error. Left-wing anti-Semitism is a significant danger. That's been the case in the last 100 years in this country, and it is the case now. Corbyn may be beaten, but what he stood for and what he allowed to happen certainly hasn't been.
I'm interested to hear you say that you think they're being knocked back quite effectively now. I mean, Keir Starmer, since he came in as leader of the Labour Party, certainly has said all the right things, and the indications are there that he's doing the right things as well. But how do you assess his moves so far on anti-Semitism? And what would your advice to him be about what he needs to do now?
Well, I mean, that's the beauty of the IRA definition. The Labour Party adopted it. Rebecca Long-Bailey stepped outside it with her commentary, refused to do anything about it. He sacked her. There was a benchmark on which he could make a judgment. That's why that definition's so important, and it's why some of those figures on the left hate it so much because they understand why it's so important. I mean, he needs to be consistent. I think he's decided that, perhaps shrewdly, he has the power to sort out the Labour Party. Doesn't have the power to sort out the country. He's leader of the opposition, but he does have the power to sort out the Labour Party. So he can demonstrate his leadership by sorting out the Labour Party. What better way, and I think easier way, than sorting out anti-Semitism? I think it is easy for him to do it. It's obvious, and I think he's going to do it. And I'm still perplexed at why Corbyn did nothing. That's beyond me. His unwillingness to do anything, and his lack of any leadership, far more confusing than some of his oddball political positions and views. But Starmer's demonstrated he's much more of a leader, and if he carries on doing that, I think that the Jewish community will respond positively on an ongoing basis. If he lets up, he'll rightly be criticised. And so I don't think the problem is going to be in the Labour Party now over the next 5 years. I don't mean that people shouldn't watch and shouldn't check and shouldn't make sure. Of course they should. And the Jewish community needs to hold the Labour Party and Sir Keir Starmer to account. But I think the bigger problem that we need to be thinking through is those people who've left the Labour Party, having joined it over the last few years, the cheerleaders for anti-Semites, the anti-Semites almost as an occupation, some of them, how they regroup and what they try and do, and how we should not let up on them. We shouldn't be letting up on them at all. That would be a very big error, because they're back on the extremes, for us to presume that they're no longer potent and couldn't do damage. We should treat them like the far right on the extremes. These people are very dangerous.
Now, of course, you gave a very clear demonstration of what it looks like to not let up on anti-Semites. That day when you saw Ken Livingstone after he'd made his comments about Hitler supporting Zionism, and you chased him into a toilet, as I recall, shouting at him that he was a Hitler apologist, and I, for one, was cheering while I was watching it, and I'm sure other people were too. And that, for a lot of people, came to symbolize actually the kind of leadership against anti-Semitism in the party that the then leadership wasn't showing. But was there ever a moment when that was all going on, when you sort of took a step back and sort of stood out of the moment and thought, how on earth has it come to this? Like, how is this happening in the Labour Party? And how am I here now having to tell the former mayor of London that he's an anti-Semite? Because the party isn't doing it.
Well, Livingstone had plenty of history, so I think some things needed saying, and as luck would have it, I had the opportunity by accident, the right place at the right time, and so I took the opportunity. But that's just one of those curiosities of being, and the truth of it was, I was incensed because I'd been briefed on what he'd said, and the reason I'd been briefed was he was repeating what Naz Shah MP had said, and yet that very day I and my team were working with Naz Shah and her office on education and linkage programs with the Jewish community to help her understand why her remarks that she'd apologized for and withdrawn were so offensive. So she's there saying, I've got it wrong, I want to understand why, because I don't, which is, I thought, was refreshingly honest. And he's repeating what she's apologized for and withdrawn. So it's a bit like Long Bailey got herself into with Maxine Peake. The moment Maxine Peake retracted, I congratulated her. but Long Bailey carried on. And there is something about this inability on the left to stand up to one's own anti-Semitism that is perplexing. I mean, Livingstone, a long history of it, but Rebecca Long Bailey, again, that's why. And I think it needs greater brains than mine to really analyse that. I mean, my role is not to give an analysis of what's going on in people's heads, but if it does go on, to challenge it. That's my little contribution. So I'm probably better at challenging Ken Livingstone than I am in giving an analysis of why he holds the views he does. I'll leave that to you, Dave, and others.
I'm happy to take that share of responsibilities. It was reported at the time that you were actually told off by the Labour chief whip for shouting at Livingstone, which I couldn't quite believe. But is that what happened?
She said to me, a woman called Rosie Winterton, she said, I think she had quite a big smile on her face. She said, "You really should be having these discussions in private, shouldn't you, John?" And I said, well, I bumped into him in public on the street. If it had been in private, I'd have been happy to have it in private. So I accepted that it'd been far better that I could have dealt with him in private. But he was in public on the radio, I think live at the time on LBC when I collared him. So the world heard what I had to say.
Oh, I think it was definitely better for the rest of us that it was in public, that's for sure. Now, I want to sort of move to the present day, really. Of course, racism and anti-racism have now become a massive issue in this country, in the United States, around the world, really, because of the Black Lives Matter movement. And there was initially a huge amount of support in the Jewish community for the Black Lives Matter movement and idea, and I think a sense that we needed to extend solidarity in the way that we hope to get it from others. But I think that support has maybe been a little bit troubled recently by some of the statements we've seen coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement in this country, that certainly some people perceive to be anti-Semitic, some very anti-Israel statements, and just a sense that there may be anti-Semitic elements in that movement. So I just want to ask you kind of what your take on it is, what you make of that movement and of that kind of idea, and what your advice would be for all of us and for the Jewish community about how to engage with it.
Yeah, there are extremists in one faction of that organization, but it's a movement, it's not an organization. And the fact that there's some Marxists, Trotskyists probably, who have some weird worldview that, of course, therefore automatically includes Israel in their list of hatreds. It's a problem, and we need to be deft in dealing with it. And I was involved in the discussions with the Premier League last week, and they've made clear that they've distanced themselves from any particular organisation. I think that's appropriate. I hope they'll adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism as well in the forthcoming weeks or months. I think that would be very useful. But the racism that black people face is not owned by some Marxist cell that manages to have an internet presence and grab part of the title that people are using. And we shouldn't be ceding anything to them. I'm in a speech, it's on the record, it's online somewhere, to the American Jewish organization, the AJC, in 2009 to their Congress, where I explained that, I learned my anti-racism from my family. My father had to challenge his own father because my aunt had 2 children who are black, alive today. And he tried to throw them out. And my father and his brothers stood up and told my grandfather he'd be thrown out. And so dealing with racism, anti-black racism, directly was part of my upbringing. And I'm always accused of it by people on the extreme left. Oh, you're just obsessed with, you only deal with anti-Semitism. Well, at the moment, that's the role I've got. So it's 95% of my time. But no, historically, that's not the case. I've dealt with all forms of racism and anti-black racism just as much. And I think it's vital, as has been learned in the United States, that the Jewish community and the black community should stand together, because the racists will divide and do divide. And it would be not just tragic, it would be against every ethos that's there if there was a division in this country. And I don't think there will be. And so people should not be scared of calling out organizations, but at the same time shouldn't use that as an excuse for not supporting just causes. And the black community and racism against the black community in this country, as well as in the United States, has been a big problem and is a big problem. And we should be proud to be fighting against it.
I mean, I agree 100% with what you're saying. I'm really struck about how personal the fight against racism and anti-Semitism is for you. And I know you've spoken in the past that you chose the title of Lord Mann of Holbeck Moor because that's where there was an anti-fascist protest outside Leeds in the 1930s. And hearing you speak now, and there's one thing that's always kind of troubled me when it comes to anti-racism, which is that when people, and I wonder if this is your experience, I want to know if this is your experience, is that when you take part, is it the case that when you take part in anti-racist struggles against racism against black people, no one asks why? But when you're so involved in tackling anti-Semitism, people kind of assume you must be Jewish or wonder why you're doing it. Is that something you've come across?
I have, though I represented the parliamentary seat of Bassetlaw, which has got virtually no black people in and virtually no Jewish people in at all. And I mean literally virtually none. And so when I dealt with anti-black racism in Bassetlaw, it wasn't always the flavour of the month. It didn't create popularity with the voters or with a section of the voters. And so there are plenty out there who are ignorant and prejudiced against many people. But it's much easier for politicians, for people on the left to challenge anti-black racism. You know, and they look at the icons who've done so, you know, Martin Luther King, Mandela, stick posts of them on the wall. The most likely Jewish figure from the past to stick on a wall would be either perhaps Marx or Trotsky, but you know, not figures of huge international credibility. And that's just how it is at the moment. History's moved in different ways, but my ask has always been this: everyone should do their little bit. What I've noted with anti-black racism is a lot of people who talk a good talk don't seem to do their little bit that often. You know, they're not actually there making the changes. You know, what changes did Corbyn make? to black representation within the Labour Party? The answer is none. None. Didn't make any. And he was a leader for 4 years. So everyone should do their little bit. And if everyone does their little bit, the cumulative add-on from that is huge. The danger is if people leave it to others. And that's my appeal to everyone tonight. Everyone should do their little bit. If everyone did 5% more, wow, what a difference that would make.
I think that's an absolutely fantastic message and a perfect place for me to hand back to Stephen Feldman to now invite some questions from our audience. The last thing I'd say is firstly to thank you for all of that, and of course to say that as an example of someone who has done substantially more than his little bit in tackling all these issues for so many years, you couldn't find a better example than John. But I'm now going to hand back to Stephen, who I think has got a few questions from the audience, who's going to put to you.
Thanks, Dave. So keep sending your questions in to me on the chat feature in the Zoom app if you've got more questions. And I noticed, Dave, you managed to cover the subject of the Black Lives Matter tweet, I think, more than adequately. I've got a question here from Daniel, who says, I note that John refers to us with regards to the Jewish community, and it suggests that he considers himself very much part of the Jewish community, an affiliate, if you like. Can John explain what triggered his close affinity to our community?
I don't want to, I hope I'm not going to upset Daniel, because the us relates to us fighting anti-Semitism. But I'm not, I think the term's a Judophile. You know, I don't go to synagogues. Well, occasionally I'm invited, I suppose, in the sense I'm invited tonight in a virtual way. But, you know, I don't, first time I went in a synagogue, other than as a tourist, was less than a year ago. Friday night dinners. You know, if we weren't in semi-lockdown, I'm open for invites, but I've only ever been to one in my entire life. You know, I think Israeli wine and all kosher wine of any kind that I've tasted is rubbish. And so,
so do we.
So, you know, it's kind of, I'm not attempting to, in any, you know, I kind of have learned enough to get my way around, you know, the different communities, and it's probably quite important that I have a sufficient a feel for the differences and some of the nuances of approach on our religious teaching and so on. But frankly, that's not where I'm coming from. I'm coming from dealing with anti-Semitism. You know, I've only ever once made a speech on the Middle East. 1980, Manchester University Students' Union. It was a good speech, I think. It was at the time it was called Two-State Solution. And I got a lot of criticism from some people for it because they regard it as too right-wing. But that's the only time I've spoken out on the Middle East as well. So it's anti-Semitism that I've dedicated more time than most to. So the us is us fighting anti-Semitism, but I am flexible. I wouldn't quite say bribable, but I have said before, if anyone can find a kosher wine that is good quality, many have tried, that is good quality, I'm prepared to be persuaded, and I'm even potentially persuadable. On Friday night dinner I went to, the food was excellent.
Okay, next time you're at a loose end on a Friday night in North London, I can guarantee there'll be plenty of invites for you. Okay, so I've got a question here which you may decide to duck, but I'm going to ask it because I'd love to hear the answer, which is it true that Corbyn's son was a leader in the PLO group that desecrated the chaplaincy synagogue at York University many years ago, and that this information was suppressed?
I don't know.
Fair enough.
Send me details. I don't know. I haven't heard that.
No, I hadn't heard that one either. Dave, had you heard that one?
No.
No, okay. I think we'll take that as a no, it's not true is the answer. Okay, there's one question that I want to get in, and I'll get it in early, which is any thoughts either on what the EHRC report is going to say, and if you're not privy to that, any thoughts on how Keir Starmer might respond to it, whatever it does say?
I'm not privy, and I haven't used my position to ask the EHRC. I'm not sure they'd tell me, but I think it'd be, they're independent. It would have been improper of me to ask them, so I haven't. So I don't know what they'll conclude, but I suspect they will be critical. I can't see how they won't be. Keir Starmer needs to go beyond whatever the EHRC asks him to do. Keir Starmer has to eradicate the level of anti-Semitism that's in the Labour Party and improve the systems. So every time there is anti-Semitism, people are re-educated or removed or both. Very simple what he has to do. And by the way, that goes for the other political parties as well. I've been dealing with, since the election, the SNP, and before the election. I'm dealing with Plaid Cymru at the moment. I've dealt with not since the election, but before the election on quite a number of occasions, the Liberal Democrats. And I'm also dealing with some Conservative MPs currently as well. So all parties need to deal with every aspect of anti-Semitism within their midst. Labour's problem's bigger because of the scale of it and the history over the last 3 years. But the others should not presume that my eye's not on them as well, because it is.
We're pleased to hear that. So a question for you. I think you said that left-wing anti-Semitism has been around and has been quite strong for a long time. And you may have mentioned 2005 as a sort of an identifying point. And Edward asked, could the Jewish community have acted more effectively back at that time to combat anti-Semitism?
Well, if they'd listened to Dave Rich, they would have done, because he's written the definitive book on this. I strongly recommend it to anyone who doesn't have a copy. In fact, I'm surprised Dave's not holding it up now. And but it's the Jewish community could have done, but frankly, the left refused to deal with the problem. And I was dealing with issues relating to Livingstone, I can recall, in 2012, and trying to get something done. So not new things, but we could have all done more. You can never do too much. And yes, I think we were complacent. And I think the Jewish community was somewhat complacent and paid a price because of that. And at the moment, there's no question that the Jewish community in the United States has been far too complacent. I don't think it is now, but it has been, about what's happening in the universities in America. Far too complacent, and has said it's a British problem, it's a European problem. And I've been over there a few times and said, no, it's an American problem, it's a Canadian problem, just as much as a British problem.
Okay, so you've just nicely segued into my next question, which somebody has asked, what about David Irving's materials being classified under history in major academic libraries? Doesn't that fuel Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism too? And I'd like to broaden that out slightly in asking you this question, because we're hearing a lot about people being cancelled, which is this new term. And you know, certainly in the academic environment, people being no platformed. So where would you be on the dichotomy between free speech on one side and anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial on the other side? Is there a space where everybody should be allowed to speak, or is there a limit on that?
No, I don't think that Holocaust denial should be left unchallenged. I'm not sure we need German or Austrian laws that make it a criminal offence, but it needs challenging, and the way in which it was challenged by Deborah Lipstadt was very powerful. I think more powerful than trying to use the criminal law. So I think our laws are good enough. I'm not a fan of having additional laws in relation to the Holocaust. But what I am a fan of is we need to win the battle of history. And one of the dangers that we face in the next 5-10 years, we won't be able to rely on witness testimony on the Holocaust. The witnesses won't be with us. I mean, who knows? Hopefully some will last longer than 10 years, but by definition, every year we lose eyewitnesses to the Holocaust. What that tells me is we need to win the battle on history and how history is written and how it's taught. And I think we've been a little lax in that. And it's not something until recently I've given much thought to. But I think it's crucial, because otherwise anyone can redefine history, and that could be very dangerous. So we need to put a lot of effort into ensuring that history is accurate, that it's well taught, and that young people learn the real histories. And the Holocaust is as big a one as there could ever be in terms of the motives of some people to distort what's there. And it'll be distortion rather than denial that's the big problem. And I think that is the bigger problem today, and that will continue to be a problem. And we should be putting a lot of effort into that.
But we shouldn't be no platforming it.
Oh, I'm all for, listen, I've got no, if I was in a university and Irving tried to speak, I would be very happy to see students and academics protest as necessary to make his speech unheard by anyone. Different ways that can be done. So I've got no compunction with someone like Irving, but I think as a general principle, what we don't want to do, and it's how we use the IRA definition in the universities, we want effective systems to hold the universities to account that they run, rather than the criminal law in addition to that already exists on hate crimes. We want universities adopting the IRA definition, and the community and people like me can then hold those universities to account for how well they're doing it. I think that's the way we should be going forward.
Right. So just following on from that, I think this, you've talked about the IRA definition a lot this evening. And I've got a question from David, who asks, what does Lord Mann think about what's to be done about the likely spike in anti-Semitism following the recent Israeli policy of annexation in the West Bank? And I think it should be said that many in our community, in the Jewish community broadly, are opposed to annexation. Not all, but many are, and probably a lot of the people here tonight are. But that's not going to make any difference to the response that we're likely to see should Israel proceed with that.
And it will be, if annexation actually happens, I'm less sure that it will by the day. However, it requires a political response. Israel's a democracy. Netanyahu's elected. Therefore, he's open game for political attacks, just as Boris Johnson is, Trump is, Corbyn is, any politician who's elected is. And we shouldn't be in any way trying to hide away from political debate. But the terms of debate are also very straightforward. The IRA definition creates the terms of debate. People who want to hold the Jewish community in Britain accountable for whatever the Israeli government does are breaching the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. People who use terms such as Nazi to describe Israeli policy are breaking the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And so we should be holding people to account. If you're not capable of participating on an anti-racist and a non-anti-Semitic basis in debate on the Middle East, then you should be keeping quiet. But if people want to attack policies, I always say, if you want to see attacks on the policies of the Israeli government, watch the Knesset, because anything that you manage to do will be mild compared to the attacks in the Knesset. Nothing wrong with political debate in the right terms. And if that's uncomfortable for any Prime Minister or President of the day, then tough on them, tough. That's their problem.
Thank you. Okay, I've got a really good question here, which is, how have you found the attitudes of Muslim MPs in both parties to the work that you've been doing?
Some have been brilliant, outstanding. Nusrat Ghani, for example, who Conservative Muslim MP who came with me to Israel, had never been to Israel before, found it a real eye-opener. And that was a very powerful. She didn't have to do that. She chose to do it. Khalid Mahmood, who's represented Birmingham, centre of Birmingham for a long time. He was on that inquiry that Dave referred to in 2006, played a big role in it. I mean, these are brave people, brave people. You know, I get all sorts of nasty stuff. And in recent years, it's been a lot nastier, including after people have been successfully prosecuted for what they've done. But that compares to nothing to what someone like Khalid Mahmood gets, simply for being prepared to recognize the existence of Israel and the existence of anti-Semitism and to challenge anti-Semitism. So there's some very brave people out there, and we don't give them sufficient recognition, in my view. He's one of the great ones because he doesn't have to do it. And I know he gets far more than he'd ever say in terms of hostility because of it, including people trying to remove him as an MP because they say, by definition, he's unfit to be an MP. And so we should be cultivating our friends, thanking them, and also listening to them.
Right. So I'm going to draw to a close, and I've got a wonderful last question for you. Nigel Allon asked, and I think he asked for all of us, for a lot of us anyway, has the time come for traditional Labour members who left the party over anti-Semitism or over Corbynism, I'm inserting that bit, has the time come for us to rejoin the Labour Party?
Well, I mean, I've kept my membership card. The Labour Party would have had to expel me. I wasn't going to go anywhere without a fight. And I thought new times would come. The people who are listening in tonight will have different political views and will be involved or vote for different parties, perhaps involved in different parties. And that's healthy in a democracy. But for those who were lifelong Labour supporters and in their hearts are, my family formed the Labour Party in Leeds in 1906 with the Jewish community. Working class Jewish people, working class people such as my family, they formed the Labour Party. And when Mosley and the Black Shirts, 2 weeks before Cable Street came to Leeds, exactly 2 weeks before, they were going to march through the Jewish quarters. And what I found in the lockdown is, because I've been doing the oral history research, because no one wrote about what had happened, I found out that my family was there on Holbeck Moor fighting the fascists. Mosley and the Black Shirts were physically removed from Leeds, and the people who removed them were the local Labour Party and the Jewish community. There were no communists there. That's why there's no press reports in the Daily Worker, unlike Cable Street. It was an area of Leeds that was run by the Labour Party. It was the Labour Party. And the Jewish community came and fought, young Jewish people fought. 30,000 people turned out 2 weeks before Cable Street, physically removed the Black Shirts. And the only regret is that I cannot verify that it was one of my family members who threw the cobblestone that hit Mosley. But who knows? No one else has yet claimed it. But if I could just end on this, because it's such an important point. No books were written. No photographs taken. There were no cameras there. The middle classes were not present. 30,000 people did what normal people do. A lot of fascists turn up in 1936 in your local area, then you remove them. That's what normal people do. It took place on a Sunday, and on the Monday they went back to work as before. That's what British people do. Decent, normal British people. And that's why I'm Lord Mann of Holbeck Moor, because that story's never been told. And we are too modest. You are too modest. I'm looking. I can see a picture of Dave Rich. I can see him, not just a picture, he's there live in front of me on the screen, up in the top, waving. Right? You have the best organisation in Jewish defence anywhere in the world, the Community Security Trust, the best. But I know how much it's taken for granted by so many people. People think it's good, they know it's good, but it's taken for granted. The Americans, the French, every other Jewish community in the world would give their right arm for the Community Security Trust. We're not very good in this country at singing our own praises. And there's a virtue in that. That's what the people of Leeds did. Normal people carried on with their normal lives. I think we should shout a bit louder, so I'm going to shout a bit louder. That's why I have the title Lord Mann of Holbeck Moor. They beat the fascists. We will beat the anti-Semites. That's why all of you doing your little bit, my plea is, do that little bit extra. Write that extra letter, make that extra phone call. Do that little bit. And then if we all do, we win. Because we are on the side of right. We win. And that's my plea to you. And I want to thank you for this opportunity.